For that period of time during the mid to late 1990s, it seemed like the WWF was in a cycle of one year having a really bad WrestleMania show, then the next year really good, the next year really bad, the next year really good, the next year really bad, the next year really good. And you definitely see that play out for WrestleMania 9 through WrestleMania 15, in my opinion. WrestleMania 9 was terrible. WrestleMania 10, very good. WrestleMania 11, very terrible, just like 9 was. WrestleMania 12, very good. And actually, I think a little underrated in terms of the overall rankings of WrestleManias all time. Now, I know a lot of people talk about the show in very positive terms, but a lot of times, ultimately, the discussion ultimately leads to talking about the main event. And granted, I get it. You're talking about a match that took up over an hour of time on the show. So as a result, it's going to get the lion's share of the focus and the lion's share of the attention because it was a big part of the show, and it was the featured kind of preeminent match on this card. But there was more to WrestleMania 12 than just that. And it's a favorite of mine as a show. There's no question about it. It took place at the Pond in Anaheim, California. And like I said, a really good show. The opening six-man tag was solid. Camp Cornette defeating Yoko, Jake, and Ahmed Johnson. No complaints. Got to find a way to get some of these guys on the WrestleMania card, get them a WrestleMania payout with a main event that's going to take over an hour. And they did that here. Stone Cold Steve Austin defeating Savio Vega. You know, this is an example here of you're bringing in Steve Austin and you're starting to turn him into this kind of Stone Cold character. He's only been in the company a couple of months. Here comes WrestleMania. And this is at a point in time, I think, where the WWF did a much better job of building future stars because they understood part of the purpose or part of the way of doing that, was to give them signature victories at Big Four pay-per-views. And this here against somebody like a Savio Vega was kind of like that introductory victory that kind of puts a guy on the map. And that's what you got here. Now, the next match is one of my favorite matches in WrestleMania history because of what it represents. Now, you're talking about Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Triple H, a guy that had been undefeated. They were pushing him down your damn throats. And you could tell that they really liked this Hunter Hearst Helmsley individual and that they were going to try and make him a big-time star someday. And, you know, with his association with the Clique and everything else, you would have thought at this time that he was going to be relatively bulletproof. As we found out in 1996, he clearly wasn't. But the bottom line is Hunter Hearst Helmsley, I feel, in this situation, learned a very valuable lesson. Is that there were Clique politics, and then there are certain individuals that rose above and transcended those Clique politics. And that one individual, for sure, above others, is the Ultimate Warrior. That Warrior came in and said, the people don't want to see that. They want to see me squash your ass. I'm going to take your finisher and no-sell them or run around like an idiot and squash you in like a minute and a half. This is back when the WWF had brought Warrior in for the third time, and they were assumingly trying to recapture that Ultimate Warrior magic one last time, and they were really trying to put him on the map in a big way with a victory over a Hunter Hearst Helmsley, somebody who hadn't lost at WrestleMania 12. Hunter talked about before he felt he was the most unprofessional guy he'd ever been with in the ring. Well, how would you know? You were in there like a minute and a half. If anything, I say that sounds completely professional. He taught you a lesson. To this day, when people talk about Triple H and they talk about his panache for burying individuals, well, I will put it to you this way. In 1996, Triple H got a lot of burying, and that burying really began here, at least initially, at WrestleMania 12 at the hands of the Ultimate Warrior. Later on in the year with the curtain call, and he got yanked from winning the King of the Ring and all of this, you know, it is what it is. But this is always one of those things. If you're somebody that dislikes Triple H and you feel like he's played this game of politics and buried people and held people down and stubbornly cling to his spot over the years, if you want to see an example of Triple H getting his comeuppance and you getting some satisfaction out of that, go watch this squash match with him and Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 12. That's all I'm going to say. Now, a match on this card, well, I do want to point out, too, that this was where you had Sable with Triple H, and then this led to, after the match, you had the debut of Mark Marrow, who apparently they thought was going to be Johnny B. Bad, not Mark Marrow, when they brought him in. So that was something notable here, too, I suppose. And the funny thing is, the next night, after this WrestleMania, is when Mankind debuted. Now, one match I think that actually gets slept on a little bit in terms of WrestleMania matches, especially when it pertains to Kevin Nash, is his WrestleMania 12 match with Undertaker. This was one of the kind of featured or headline matches on this card, and this was a really good big man match. Now, it's not one of Taker's best WrestleMania matches ever, but I think it's definitely one of Kevin Nash's. I mean, not that he had a whole lot of them necessarily, but the fact of the matter remains was that this was actually a very good match. The story heading into this was pretty good. It was very well played out and very well laid out and done. And, these two guys went out there and I think had the best match that those two possibly could have with each other. And I think Nash doesn't get enough credit, Diesel, for this match here at WrestleMania 12. Everybody will talk about him and Shawn at WrestleMania 11 and they'll, sing the praises of that to Kingdom Come and Skipty Skip and Whoop-de Whoop. But this was a good Mania match. This really was. This is something that if you didn't have the match you had main eventing WrestleMania 12, this is a match you actually could have had for the title and drawn some money with, and people would have been pleased with it and said, oh, it wasn't one of the worst title matches in Mania history, that's for sure. Now, when I talk about special matches in WrestleMania history, though, and I know I talked about Warrior and Helmsley at 12 is one of my favorites. Another one of my all-time WrestleMania favorites. That doesn't mean the best, but it means one of my favorites. That goes along the lines of like Hogan and Andre at 3, and Hogan and Warrior at 6, and Roberts and Martel at 7, the blindfold match. Another match that fits into there is Roddy Piper versus Goldust in the Hollywood Backlot Brawl. This is classic. Classic Vince, needless to say. This was physical. This was brutal. This was kind of a precursor to a lot of the stuff you would see done, frankly, in the Attitude Era. If you would have seen this type of match executed at a WrestleMania 14 or 15 or 16 or 17, you'd have been like, it just kind of blends in. But here, this was very different for the WWF and their style, and this was a very unique match. And you had this kind of like sexual cretin type of character in Goldust, and then kind of that manly man's man, even though he wore a kilt, a skirt, whatever you want to call it, and Roddy Piper trying to make a man out of Goldust. It worked really well. The dynamic between these two worked really well. The build up to this match was done very, very well. One of my favorite parts obviously has to be the chase in the white Ford Bronco. Remember those? Some people in my age demographic will most certainly remember the O.J. Simpson chase in 1994 and remember that trial. And this was a perfect attempt for the WWF and Vince McMahon to kind of latch onto that, make parody of it, and make fun of it. For those of you that think things like the Trayvon Martin case or other big-time cases like Casey Anthony and so on and so forth were huge deals in this country, when they say trial of the century, we could even go back maybe to the Lindbergh baby abduction, the trial of the 20th century in this country, without question, was the O.J. Simpson trial. And this was in the early days of the internet, so you didn't have the social media that you have now and all of this. This was everywhere. This dominated American pop culture for over a damn year. I cannot underestimate or underemphasize that enough to you, I should say. This dominated pop culture for over a year. This was the lead story every single night on every single local news program and national news program and every cable news program. Everything was all about the O.J. Simpson case and what it represented and what had happened and who was involved. I mean, my God. And the genius of the WWE to sit there and say, hey, we're going to do a white Bronco chase between Piper and Goldust. We're going to have Piper freaking call in talking about he's chasing Goldust. It was kind of one of these things that didn't even necessarily have a clean finish or pure finish, and it didn't fucking matter. This match is a favorite of mine and always will be. I love things that are unique, and this is one of the most unique matches in WrestleMania history. There is no question about it, and as a result, is one of my favorites. Now, of course, you get to the main event, and that is the 60-minute Iron Man match for the WWF Championship. And I know Pat Patterson always likes to talk about kind of how this was his idea, and he took so much pride in what these two guys went out there and did. Vince McMahon talks about the fact that they thought it was so unique that they could build this entire event and really shifting away from the steroid days of the 80s and the early 90s, spotlight a new type of performer, a new type of star, and saying these guys are kind of the wave of the future and the way of the future for the WWF and the wrestling business as a whole. Whereas WCW is featuring these guys and these guys and these guys, we're going to go with the young, more athletic guys. And this is the type of product and presentation you're going to get from the WWF. One of the problems I've always found with this kind of spin job that the WWF has done is that they act like nobody ever in the history of man or professional wrestling has ever done a 60-minute match or a 60-minute match as a part of a featured show. Come on. You've had these type of matches all throughout the years. Maybe not so much in the WWF, but just about every other major wrestling company in the territorial days, just about every one of them would have 60-minute draws to close out the show or have 60-minute matches on their big cards. This was not a unique concept, but the build up to this, it was kind of unique too. You were doing babyface versus babyface. You had the two guys that could go in there and make this work. And the great thing about Shawn and Bret was they were two phenomenal performers, and they did things that made them look good, but also could make the other individual look good. And one thing I always appreciated about both Bret and Shawn was their ability to go out there and make just about anybody that they worked with better than they ever would have been if they wouldn't have worked with them, and be able to adapt and adjust to the strengths and weaknesses of the other performer that they were in there with, and accentuate those positives and hide those negatives. And this match here, now, when you go back and watch it, it's kind of slow moving. I mean, let's face it, this is a match that lasted a little over an hour. So as a result, it can be a bit hard to get through. But if you are a fan of great in-ring storytelling, if you are a fan of watching two professionals, two master magicians at their craft, go apply their craft and do it better than maybe anybody else at the time, if you are a fan of building up drama and building up suspense and seeing how a big-time match should be done, then Shawn Michaels versus Bret Hart for the WWF Championship in the 60-minute Iron Man match at WrestleMania 12 is the match for you. And the great thing about this is it went to overtime. 60 minutes wasn't enough. You did it without a pinfall. All the other Iron Man matches you've seen over the years, they go 3-2 or 5-3 or 5-4 or 4-3 or whatever in terms of the pinfalls. 60 minutes, they didn't have a pinfall, which is to me what really makes this stand out. And in terms of WWF's history, it makes it easily to me the greatest Iron Man match in the history of the company. Now, in terms of the overall ranking of this show, and at this time, it was time to go with Shawn. Shawn was the guy. Shawn was ready. Bret wanted to go off and do some other things. Bret had had his run. He had had his moment. It was time to go with Shawn for a little bit. And I always liked how these two worked off of each other because you could tell they had really good in-ring chemistry, but behind the scenes you could also see where it kind of showed through that these guys really didn't necessarily like each other all that much. They worked very stiff, they worked tough and snug, and I loved it. And a lot of other people loved it too. In terms of the overall all-time rankings of this show, I'm not necessarily sure if this is a top 5 WrestleMania or not. But I don't think it's as far away. And I think that's owed in part to the overall quality of the card. This was not a one-match show. Even though that one match went over an hour and is a WrestleMania all-time classic, this card had more going for it. Sadly, the next year's WrestleMania, pretty much for the most part, was really, in all effect, a one-match card. It could have used some of the magic here in '96 for WrestleMania 13 in 1997. That's for damn sure.